She tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter like she was checking out a rental house instead of coming home. "Breakfast at 5, Sophia said, half laugh, half command. "Don't be late." I looked at the keys, at the way the ring flashed in the morning sun, at the man behind her who looked like he'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine and into my living room. I set the kettle on the stove and told myself I'd humor them. Then, because I always get the last word in small domestic wars, I set my alarm for 4. Malibu is polite about mornings. There's a soft scrape of waves, a gull or two that sounds like an apologetic trumpet, and at 4, the deck is still blue in a way that makes you believe anything is possible. I stood barefoot on the tile and watched the horizon decide whether it wanted to become day. The keys were still there on the counter like evidence. I made the coffee slow, strong, and stubborn. They arrived at 6, not 5. Derek liked being late the way some people liked being charming. He greeted me with the kind of half-smile that had probably gotten him upgraded seats on planes and low-interest terms on other people's generosity. He ordered eggs Benedict for himself, 3 egg omelets for Sophia, and black coffee with a complicated nod toward local roasters. He arranged his napkin like a man who had been taught to take up space and expected the room to expand for him. For the first hour, I let him be an amusing interruption. He told me about his projects, how he liked to invest in opportunities, and how people who own property should think about getting their assets working, which is how men like him say politely, "You could hand me your house and you would call it a favor." Sophia agreed with him in the easy way daughters agree with husbands when their loyalty is still a work in progress. I watched them both and felt one of those old, sharp sensations, like the edge of a thought bumping a bruise. Something was off. It wasn't any single thing. It was a constellation. The watch Derek wore was nicer than his shoes. He told a story about a company that no one else at the table seemed to have heard of. He sidestepped when I asked about the investment he planned for my house. And when he laughed at a story I told from years ago, something about a lost dog and a stubborn neighbor, his laugh came a second too late, like a man reading the social cue from someone else's script. I should have left it there. I should have said, "Enjoy your omelets," and let Sophia and her new husband find their own equilibrium. But this is where the plot of my life bends toward things I did not expect. When a stranger sounds like he is auditioning to rewrite the equation of my family and my home, I don't just stand by. I look. If you're watching this and thinking, "That's paranoid," I get it. I was the woman who had spent 30 years paying attention to small things. The tilt of a picture frame, which drawer the teaspoons live in, the difference between a daughter's hesitation and a daughter's silence. I was 52, and my house had a lot of my history in it. There's a stubbornness that comes with keeping one's things. Not greed exactly, but a refusal to have someone else rearrange the story of your life without your consent. The first night, I did something small and domestic to mark a boundary. I moved the spare key from under the potted rosemary to a proper lockbox in the laundry room. It felt petty and necessary all at once. The next morning, I began poking, delicately, where curiosity meets caution. You learn to dig quietly. I started from the obvious: public records, property deeds, transfers, mortgages. There are 1,000 clerks and 100 forms that, when you look with patient eyes, tell the stories people are trying to hide. Derek's name wasn't on anything, at least not directly. What showed up were shell phrases, LLCs with soothing corporate names that suggested consultancy, capital, asset management. There were 3 LLCs connected to the neighborhood over a 2-year span, each dissolved a few months after being formed. There was a foreclosure notice in a nearby county tied to a different name, and a tiny handwritten obituary for a woman who, according to her neighbor's comments, had welcomed a charming young man into her life weeks before losing her house. That's the thing about con artists. They build their work out of intimacy. They borrow language and furniture and manners. They learn what a person needs to feel safe and then make that need the framework of a trap. I wasn't looking for a scandal. I was looking for confirmation. But confirmation came faster than comfort. I called one name that popped up in an article, a woman named Eleanor Patterson. She'd been 78 when she'd lost her home after a series of friendship investments gone wrong. The voice on the phone was small and brittle with fatigue. When she recognized me, the woman who'd shared a fundraiser with her years ago, she cried like someone who had been awake for too long. She told me, in fits and stops, about a man who had been helpful and then insistent, about evenings that started with wine and ended with signatures on forms she didn't remember reading. She had been a careful woman. She didn't know how the lending papers had been made to look like her own. I have to stop here and tell you, plainly, I did not set out to become a detective. I set out to go to breakfast with my daughter. But some people, when they smell a pattern that threatens someone else, cannot walk away. The first real break came when I picked up the phone and called a number printed on a faded business card I found in a file. Harold Manning, forensic accountant. He answered in that flat, no-nonsense voice that is the hallmark of people who have had their eyes open to fraud more times than they liked. Harold asked for details, then asked for copies of everything I had. "Paper trail," he said. "You can't fake what you leave behind if you know where to look." Harold found things quickly. Payments routed through a third party to a catering company that had closed in 2019, Jennifer Walsh's company. I dialed Jennifer with my fingers shaking. Her greeting had the same dry humor I remembered from the town council bake sale. When I told her the names, she swallowed a laugh that was also a sob. "Derek," she said. "Yes, him. He married nice people and left us with empty accounts and a debt collector's phone all over my voicemail. She told me about a wedding reception she'd booked that never got paid for, clients she had to refund, and a trust she'd thought would carry her through slow months. She sounded like someone who had been taken by the same pattern as Eleanor. There is a peculiar, terrible solidarity in these conversations. They're full of small intimacies. He said I was the only one who really understood him, Jennifer told me, then added, he was very good at making people feel seen. When men like Derek work, they are artisans in attention. They practice kindness like a skill, and in the gaps between compliments, they harvest signatures, deeds, and authorization. The more I found, the more I felt the old animal inside me, protective and fierce. I also felt something heavier, the temptation to be clever back. It is a human thing to want immediate correction for immediate injury. We are not all saints when our children and our property and our dignity are at stake. For a few days I lived in that fog between righteous action and vengeful impulse. And then I did something I will always regret and never fully explain away. I made him sick. I will not tell you how. I will not give you a how-to, because that is not what this is. What I can tell you is this. Late on a humid evening, while the house slept and the ocean hummed like a distant engine, I performed a small private experiment in boundaries. It felt at first like a petty prank, and then like an act of war. He collapsed at breakfast. He vomited in my kitchen and clutched the sink like a man surprised by his own body. Sophia cried. I sat on the floor with my palms pressed to cool tile and counted my breaths. We went to urgent care because there was no other option. The doctor was decent, clinical, and alarmed by the speed of the symptoms. He asked the routine questions: allergies, recent travels, medications. Derek answered like someone improvising a life for a stranger, and the nurse took notes with a pen that clicked. I watched Derek's face as he tried on the role of vulnerable patient, and I felt something slippery and ugly in my stomach. Afterwards, when the immediate thunder had passed and the antiseptic smell of the clinic had faded into the memory of cloying coffee and salt air, I knew I had crossed a line. It hadn't felt glorious. It had felt cowardly at times, petty at others, and like a confession waiting to happen the entire while. I thought of Eleanor on the phone, of Jennifer's weary laughter. I thought of my daughter's face at the clinic, confused, protective, a little betrayed. That image stung more than anything else. I told myself the thing people tell themselves when they have done something they are not proud of. I did it because I couldn't watch him practice harm here and do nothing. The legal reality of that night hung over us like humidity. You can't unmake a choice by thinking about the consequences after the fact. I called Harold and told him what had happened. He braced himself and said what all responsible adults say in those moments. You need to tell someone with authority. This isn't between us anymore. Which is how a private act of revenge, and yes, that is what it was, began to shift into something else. I started to collect instead of conceal. I bagged up the napkin Derek had used to blot his lips the morning he'd ordered Eggs Benedict, and I photographed receipts and noted the times of calls. It feels ridiculous to list objects like evidence, but when you hand a packet to a detective, you might as well do it with the care of a librarian. Paper is stubborn. Lies are slippery. Paper catches us. Filing a complaint is a strange business. You are simultaneously a citizen and a complainant, a victim and an accuser. Detective Sarah Chen walked into my kitchen with a notebook and the kind of steady patience I'd come to respect. She has a way of listening that doesn't rush you into the point. She wanted to hear the story from start to end. I poured the events out. The breakfast demand, the small research, the phone calls to Jennifer and Eleanor, the LLCs that rose and fell like foam along a tide. I told her about the thing I had done that I wasn't proud of. You can watch the color leave someone's face in slow motion. It does not matter how many broken cups or small betrayals one carries. Confession is a weight. Detective Chen did not praise me. She did not scold me either. She wrote, and sometimes her pen paused in the air, like she was measuring whether the words would fit a legal form. "We can't ignore someone who takes advantage of elders," she said. Then came the part I'd feared and half wanted. "But we can't solve crimes with more crimes. You did the right thing by coming to us with what you know." Her voice made a line between what I'd done and what still needed doing. It was an invitation and a rebuke at once. She told me federal investigators would be interested if there were patterns across counties and if the money trail crossed state lines. That phrase, federal investigators, had the air of a summons. It felt at once like a hope and a risk. There is a particular moral clarity that arrives when the paperwork is in order. We did what detectives and investigators do. We turned the story into a dossier. Jennifer sent photocopies of unpaid invoices she kept in a shoebox. Eleanor mailed me a stack of documents her son had found in an attic. Harold created spreadsheets that made the flow of money look like blood, diagnostic and undeniable. It was less satisfying than I'd imagined. Evidence tempers rage. It doesn't feed it. Sophia did not forgive me immediately. She was angry and embarrassed and protective of Derek, as many daughters are at first when their romantic lives come under fire. She would stand in the doorway and watch me go through a file, her hands in the pockets of the robe he'd left behind. In her eyes, I was at once the woman who had taught her to be stubborn and the woman who had done something that felt like betrayal. We argued. We cried. Twice she left the house, and twice she came back. The small rituals of living, who empties the dishwasher, who waters the geraniums on the deck, became, for a while, how we measured whether we could be a family again. When the complaint reached the right desk, the nature of the investigation shifted. Detective Chen, who had become my interface with the official world, told me that financial crimes units prefer patterns to single incidents. "If we can show a chain," she said, "we can get subpoenas, we can follow money, and we can, potentially, stop more victims before the next signature hits the paper." She spoke like someone with the taste for stopping a problem at its source. Her tone made me think of public service announcements and the slow work of change. A week later, Harold texted me a picture of a ledger he'd found buried in a folder. Rows of deposits that lined up like footprints, transfers that looped through companies with polite names until they landed in accounts that belonged to men I'd never met. Harold's fingers, it turned out, were the kind that could read money like tea leaves. He emailed me a map of transactions with little arrows that felt like the trajectory of a constellation. The map made my stomach drop. It wasn't just Derek. It was a method. It was, as Harold said with a flat online message, a network. When the word came through my phone, I felt both vindicated and exhausted. Networks are hard to dismantle. They have redundancies and plausible deniability, and men who do the dirty work with the politeness of a handshake. Networks are not built on one bad actor. They are built on many who find the same treadmill of kindness profitable. Around that time, a woman named Jennifer Walsh suggested a name for what we were seeing, the Heartbreak Network. It was melodramatic, maybe, but it fit. The name captured how these scams worked. Intimacy turned instrument. The label also helped people talk about it without shame. When you can name something, you can reckon with it. As the evidence accrued, detective meetings got more formal. I sat in a conference room with Detective Chen and Harold and a lawyer from the county who had the useful habit of asking precise questions. Sophia came once, and she sat quietly in the corner picking at her nails, while Derek sent me increasingly theatrical voicemails, apologizing and insisting that their intentions had been sincere. It was the way guilty men try to reframe the record, sincerity as a shield. Through all of this, I had a private life to maintain. I watered plants. I played the old vinyl records my husband used to like. Some nights I woke at 3 a.m. and sat on the deck while the cold air tasted of salt and possibility. I would let the ocean talk me back into the version of myself that wasn't defined by court forms and suspicious LLCs. There is a small sanctity in everyday things. Making a proper cup of tea, folding a towel the same way my mother taught me, that keeps you human when the world is trying to turn you into a file. You might wonder, videos need a hook, don't they? Where the sense of danger lived in all this? It lived in the tone of Derek's messages when he thought he was being clever. It lived in the way strangers called my number, asking about potential sales. It lived in the look Sophia gave me when Derek suggested reorganizing our estate plan. The phrase dropped like a pebble into a pond and watched for ripples. Danger was not fireworks. It was the steady, invasive trust of someone who believes your loneliness is a blank check. One evening, after a day of meetings and spreadsheets and enough coffee to refuel a small car, I opened my front door to find a plain envelope slipped under the mat. There was no return address. Inside, a photograph of Derek, smiling at a gala, and a note in a hand that trembled with the deliberate calm of intimidation. We know where you live. The paper smelled faintly of cigar smoke. When you find a threat in your mailbox, you realize that the world has small vectors for terror. I called Detective Chen, and then I called Sophia, and then I called Harold. We did the adult things that adults do when the stakes get real. Change locks, print additional copies of documents, make lists of the friends who would know the truth if anything happened. That night, I slept with the light on in the hallway, because sometimes the smallest acts of defiance are all you have. At some point in the middle of gathering proof and sleeping badly, I realized I had become a different kind of person. I was still my old self, the woman who knew how to plant lavender and who preferred a plain breakfast. But alongside that, I had a new operating system. I was a collector of stories, a hoarder of paperwork, a person who would no longer let someone who polished his charm on other people's lives do the same in mine. This is where the story pivots towards something else. This is the place where private grievance starts to want a public remedy. I sat with Harold in my kitchen one late afternoon, and he pushed a stack of printouts across the table like a bridge. "You can go to the district attorney," he said, "but if this spans state lines, you get the feds, and if you get the feds, there's a higher chance you find the structure, and maybe, stop it from moving to someone else." He put his hand on top of a copy of an LLC filing. The font looked like a barcode. It is a strange thing to feel both frightened and oddly relieved at the mention of the FBI. The Bureau is not an instrument of instant justice. It is a methodical machine that moves slowly and deliberately. But methodical is what we needed. The last thing I wanted was for my reactionary moment, making Derek sick, to be the headline that obscured the larger enterprise. Detective Chen agreed. She said the first step was a well-documented complaint. She advised me to clean up the edges of what we had. Statement from Eleanor, receipts from Jennifer, Harold's financial analysis. She warned me that federal investigations are messy and long, that they take patience and sometimes require that you play a waiting game that feels like inaction. You have to hold on to your part of the story and trust the process, she said. We assembled the packet like a patient undertaking. Piece by piece, a narrative emerged that looked less like a single grudge and more like a pattern. It had motive, means, and opportunity, written in the dull fonts of municipal filings and bank transfers. It had victims with names and voices who spoke of lost savings and lost time and lost trust. It had, oddly enough, a moral architecture. People who thought they were owed kindness, and men who had decided that kindness was a currency to be spent. After we handed the file to Detective Chen, after she promised she would put it where it would be seen by the right people, I felt a curious combination of exhaustion and lightness. There is a release in doing the correct thing, even if the correct thing is slow. I began to think about consequences the legal way: subpoenas, indictments, the painstaking slow method of piecing together a case so that it could not be dismissed as hearsay. But life has a way of refusing to wait for the judicial calendar. About 2 days after the packet went to the county desk, Derek showed up on my porch with a bouquet of flowers and a new story about why he was there. He wanted to apologize and clean things up. He spoke about wanting us to be a family again, and Sophia, blessed, muddled thing that she is, gazed at him with the shadow of love and hope on her face. When he stepped into the kitchen, I saw in close-up what I had suspected in outline. The man who could convince a room he was harmless had sharpened his performance around the edges. He was polished, practiced, and now he was trying on contrition like a new coat. He left within an hour, but he left behind a sense of being observed. He left a voicemail that made me uncomfortable because it sounded rehearsed. That evening, Harold called me with a voice that matched the cadence of someone who had seen a line drawn and was deciding whether to cross it. "I've mapped more transfers," he said. "There's a hub in 5 different counties. There are at least a dozen names, some of them attached to homes, others just to bank accounts. This is bigger than a single honey trap." When the phrase heartbreak network stopped being a metaphor and started to look like an organizational chart, the stakes became clearer. That is the moment when private retribution is no longer just personal. It touches a public wrong. Detective Chen asked for patience. She asked me to keep living my life, but to keep a careful ledger of interactions. She warned me not to publicize the complaint. "Not yet," she said. "There's a way these investigations have to be handled so people aren't tipped off. If your name goes public, you make it easier for them to scatter." I complied, mostly, though the impulse to shout the name of the man who had tried to take my house from the rooftops was nearly irresistible. Instead, I taped a little note inside my file cabinet. "Evidence packet. Do not touch." It was pathetic and necessary. On a rainless morning, when the ocean had the color of pewter and the gulls flew as if they were carrying messages between rooftops, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Whitmore?" a voice said. It was polite and brisk, the kind of voice that had been trained to sound calm when saying significant things. "This is Agent Martinez with the FBI Financial Crimes Task Force. Detective Chen forwarded your packet. We'd like to speak with you about possible coordination." The packet had been read. The room tilted inward. There are moments when the world does exactly what you hope it might, when the system you trusted responds, and at the same time, a new sense of dread arrives. The federal government is a big animal. To have it interested in your story is to invite scrutiny, protection, and risk. I agreed to meet. I told Detective Chen. We arranged a date. And for the first time since the Eggs Benedict, The drama that had begun as a domestic quarrel about breakfast had the outlines of a public story. There would be interviews, there would be questions, there would be forms. There would likely be a moment when the house that had sheltered my life would become a site in a legal map. Sophia stood beside me at the kitchen sink when the FBI call came. She reached for my hand, and I realized, in that tiny contact, how much of a daughter's life is made up of small decisions. Whether to believe a partner, whether to trust a parent, whether to sit with someone who has disappointed you. She squeezed my fingers and said, in a voice that finally had more steel than softness, "If they ask me to testify, I will." That sentence, simple as it was, felt like a small victory. There would be no Hollywood rupture and then immediate reconciliation. There would be court dates and depositions, and the slow, grinding work of unraveling a network that specialized in charm. There would also be the private work, rebuilding a relationship with my daughter, teaching her to be wary without teaching her to shut off her heart. A few days later, I found myself at a small government building with a mug of tepid coffee and a file that had been normalized into bureaucratic language. Agent Martinez was a tall man with a patient voice. Agent Kim, who joined the meeting, had the kind of efficient manner that makes you feel safer and simultaneously more exposed. They listened as I laid out what I knew, Harold's spreadsheet reflecting on a screen like a constellation of transactions, and the calls from victims echoing in the recording I played for them. "You did what you could to create evidence," Agent Martinez said when I finished, "and you did the right thing by bringing it to law enforcement." He did not say I was brave, because bravery is the kind of thing people pile on later. He said instead what mattered in that fluorescent lit room. "This is actionable. We'll need to coordinate. We'll need you to be available. We may place you as a local liaison while the task force operates. It is an odd thing to be told you might be asked to help the people who are investigating the man you harmed. It is an odd thing because the moral ledger is never clean. I had made a choice that night by the sink, and now the system that sought ethical resolution also offered me a role that would force me to observe my own actions through a public mirror. When I left the building, the sun was out, and the ocean glittered like something frivolous. People who weren't inside my head went about their days with a blissful ignorance. I held my file tight the way a person holds a small animal. The world had shifted from a kitchen spat to an unfolding federal investigation. Somewhere in the background, like the low drum roll of a distant storm, the idea of an organized network pulsed through my thoughts. The first part of the work, discovery, documentation, the ugly moment of my private retaliation, was behind me. The next part, the legal part, was beginning. I felt like someone who had taken a first step onto a long, unlit path and then realized the path was lined with cameras and microphones and people with badges. At dusk, I sat on the deck with a cup of tea and watched as the sky went the color of bruise and then softened. Sophia came out and sat beside me. We didn't speak of the details. We let the small things, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant lights of other houses, fill the space. At some point, she turned to me and said very quietly, "You could have told me before." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I could have avoided doing something foolish." She sighed. "You did something foolish." "Yes," I said, "I did. But I also did the right thing after. I tried to fix it the way the world fixes things when they break, with paperwork, with witnesses, with people whose job is to do the unpleasant work." She looked at me like she was measuring what would be left once the dust settled. "Promise me one thing," she said. "Promise that if this gets ugly, you don't try to fix it yourself." Her voice had the firmness of someone who, at 28, had learned that either their partner or their mother would be the one to stand between them and harm. I promised. It felt like the most adult thing I had done in weeks. We headed inside with the light fading. On my kitchen counter sat the ring of keys, glinting in a pool of lamplight. I picked them up without thinking and felt their weight like a small talisman. Sometimes the best defense is not a fortress, but the habit of paying attention. 2 hands on a kettle, eyes on a ledger, the willingness to pick up the phone. That night, when I set my alarm, I chose it not to be 4 anymore, but to be ready for whatever came next. The next step would require patience, legal counsel, and the kind of cooperation that moves slowly but surely. The next step would also require me to explain a foolishness I had committed, and so I prepared to do that. I rehearsed the sentences in my head. I made a list of the victims I had contacted and the ones I had not. I called Jennifer and thanked her for trusting me with her truth. I told Eleanor that I would not let her story be just another headline. I cleaned the kitchen and made a proper list of everything I'd need to hand over. 2 nights after Agent Martinez's call, Detective Chen knocked on my door with a new face beside her, a woman whose badge read Agent Kim. They did not come with sirens or shouting. They came with the calm of people who do not need drama to be effective. "We're coordinating with Minneapolis and Santa Barbara," Agent Kim said. "If our initial review confirms what your packet suggests, this may be larger than any of us expected." There are moments that feel like a hinge. This was one. The hinge had the texture of a small, ordinary front step and the weight of federal interest. I walked them through my files. I gave them access to the recordings I'd made with Sophia's reluctant consent, and I told them about the envelope under my doormat. They took notes, moved methodically, and asked the right questions. They asked me to be patient, to keep my phone on, to let them do the dangerous things that law enforcement is trained to do. When they left, my kitchen felt both emptied and full. There was a sense of direction now, and with direction often comes danger. I sat at my table and folded another piece of laundry carefully, because habit is the last thing to go when anxiety sets foot in a life. That night, as the house settled, I thought about the first line of this story, the keys on the counter, the demand for breakfast, the way a day could swing toward crisis because someone else presumed entitlement. I thought about how small acts can have enormous consequences, and how the same house that sheltered 3 generations could also be a site of a crime in the making. Soon we would learn more. Soon the task force would begin the slow, methodical work of following money. Soon, perhaps, there would be a knock at my door that would not be for coffee or apology. For now, I folded another towel and set it neatly in the stack. The ocean was a dark ribbon in the night, and the house waited with its lights on, patient and vigilant. They called the meeting a coordination, which is to say they did not bring sirens or a camera crew. The first time federal agents stood in my kitchen, it felt oddly bureaucratic. Clipboards, badges, a laptop that hummed like an appliance, and a man with perfectly arranged hair who kept apologizing for the fluorescent lights. Agent Martinez had the calm voice of someone who spends his days making sense of other people's chaos. Agent Kim carried a legal pad and an air of low-key competence. Detective Chen was there like an old friend who'd been invited into a clique she both trusted and questioned. We sat at my kitchen table with Herald spreadsheets fanned across it like evidence confetti. There was a feeling in the room, not of victory, exactly, but of alignment. When the federal agents listened to the recordings I had made, when they read Jennifer's invoices and Eleanor's notes, you could see them assembling a map that looked more like a criminal network than the sporadic misfortunes of lonely people. That is the inflection point in any investigation, when the messy stories of hurt become a single, traceable pattern. I told them something else in that meeting. I told them about the envelope, the photograph, the note that smelled faintly of cigar smoke. I told them about the night I had made Derek sick. I did not tell it like a confession in a movie where guilt plays out in montage. I told it in the flat, factual way you tell bureaucrats things you already know will be complicated. Detective Chen listened. Agent Martinez's jaw tightened a fraction. "We have to document that," he said. "We will need full disclosure. That doesn't mean charges will follow, but we have to be transparent." There it was, accountability from both sides. The law doesn't reward revenge, and the federal people were painfully aware that a justified fury can still cross into illegality. They also recognized that I had been one of the few people willing to go beyond the envelope under the mat. That, in the calculus of the room, mattered. The first task the task force gave me was simple in description and complicated in consequence. Be available. That meant keep my phone on, keep my schedule flexible, and crucially, do not act on my own impulses. To be useful to the investigation, I would have to watch rather than provoke. It felt like being asked to stop a small animal from gnawing at something dangerous. Patience, I learned, was their currency. Weeks of preparation followed. There were interviews and depositions and moments of domestic boredom that smelled of paper and reheated coffee. Agents flew in and out. Signatures were made. A federal prosecutor read over Harold's spreadsheet and marked it with questions like a schoolteacher. They explained, repeatedly and patiently, that to indict you need to show more than motive. You need a through line of intent and movement. Documents, witnesses who can testify to coercion, bank flows that traced like footsteps across state lines. It was the sort of slow, legal choreography that sings the praises of patience. One evening, during a long brief where Agent Kim walked me through the roles that each member of the task force would play, I found myself oddly calm. Maybe my nerves had been ground down by living with the threat so long that the officer's procedural language sounded like safety, subpoenas, grand juries, evidentiary standards. Or maybe I was comforted by the idea that the thing that had started as a domestic spat now had teeth, professionals who knew how to use the law. We began setting small traps of a legal kind. There were recorded phone calls made with my consent, arranged through the agents. I would call Derek under pretext, asking about a vase he'd left, or a charity donation, and the agents would record. They advised us on what to say and what not to say. They told me to be as natural as I could manage. Sophia sat in a room with a recorder and made the choice, again and again, to tell the truth when asked. That was enormous. Watching my daughter say, simply and plainly, I remember him asking me to sign it, stripped away the romantic fog that some people, loving people, allow to cushion their partner's behavior. There were moments I hated, the way I watched my own voice on a recording and found it too flat or too defensive or too eager to smooth things over. There were moments I liked, the way Harold's analysis pulled apart supposed explanations until they were just numbers, unsentimental and plain. We built a narrative together that had a beginning, a method, and victims who were no longer anonymous. The task force wanted to move cautiously. They said, "We need him to come back." It was an odd thing to hear, like being asked to bait a hook on behalf of the law. And I felt that tug of an old instinct, the one that had led me to act on my own the night Derek got sick. This time, though, the call was not mine to make. The agents planned the invitation, used my voice for it, and sat with me as they put the leverage points in place. They told me how to answer when Derek called. They coached Sophia on what to say if he tried to manipulate her with emotions. They arranged surveillance at my house without making it obvious to neighbors. They explained search warrants in the way people explain something necessary but heavy. I will never forget the night we made the call that would bring him back. I held the phone with two hands like it was a fragile animal and said the words we'd rehearsed. We invited him to collect some documents he'd left, to clear the air, to retrieve personal items. We said nothing dramatic. We sounded domestic and forgiving, the bait of anyone who's been played on purpose. Derek bit. He returned. I had no illusions about the scene that would follow. The agents had rehearsed the likely contingencies. He could come alone. He could bring an ally. He could be armed. To think of someone pointing a gun in your house is to take a miniature apocalypse and play it out. What you cannot know is the taste in your mouth when it happens. Is it iron? Is it cold? Is it only the realization that the fictional problem you'd worried about is now actually a person standing in your doorway? It was night when his truck rolled onto the drive. The house hummed with the kind of ordinary noises that make you forget you are being watched. The refrigerator cycling, a neighbor's late laugh, waves in the distant dark. I sat in the kitchen like a person in a play, while Agent Martinez fed me small signals through an earpiece. Sophia sat at the far end of the counter, hands clenched but composed. Detective Chen stood in the shadow of the hallway, her presence a kind of stubborn physical assurance. Derek came in with a swagger down to the butcher block counter, like he'd never been questioned in his life. He had flowers that looked new and a smile that had been polished for performances. He asked where the papers were, and I nodded toward the guest room where, under supervision, agents had placed a small stack of possessions. He moved through the house like someone who owned the air. That arrogance is what makes predators so dangerous. They bring their own atmosphere. At one point, he stopped and looked toward the kitchen where I stood. Maybe he wanted to see whether I'd been weakened by the night. Perhaps he wanted to test my reaction in front of an audience. Instead of a private confrontation, there was a hum in the walls, the discreet presence of law enforcement waiting to turn a moment into a legal fact. The wire was on. The recording was happening. The patience of the operation felt almost insulting to his dignity, and, to be honest, satisfying in a small, civil way. Then he moved toward the guest room, and that's when something snapped. He came back out carrying a small satchel, and with a furtive, sharp movement that took less than a second to change the atmosphere in the kitchen. The edge of the moment was not cinematic in a Hollywood way. It was sudden and contained. A hand gone to a pocket, a metal glint, a shift in the body weight that screamed for attention. Agent Martinez later told me that in that fraction of a second, they had to decide whether to act on probable cause and how to preserve the safety of everyone in the house. You hear a lot of different versions of gun time. The way it is described in movies, slow, close-up eyes and dramatic music, is not the way it actually feels. It feels like compressed air, like the grinding hush before a tidal wave. My heart had the sensation of halting, and the only thing that existed was sound. A small scrape of a shoe, the click of a zipper, the distant ticking of a clock. Someone said something very quickly and very clearly into a microphone. Then trained people moved. What followed unfolded with the sort of professional choreography you place your trust in when you cannot place your trust in a human reaction. Men in plain clothes stepped forward with shouted commands, not cinematic but effective. Derek froze, then resisted, then, briefly, dramatically, tried to run. There was a struggle that was frightening because it was real, not because it was graphic. At one point I heard a metallic thunk, and the kitchen light seemed too bright. Then, the sound of handcuffs. They took him out of my house with his hands behind his back, and with a face that had shifted from predatory charm to the alertness of someone who had been finally seen for what he was. There were agents at the door, and neighbors came out in small clusters, their faces lit by porch lights and the blue pulse of squad cars. No gunfire was discharged. There was no gruesome spectacle. There was, instead, the hollow sound of someone being led away. Afterwards, in the quiet that follows a storm, Detective Chen came back inside and picked up a cup of tea like she'd been there the whole time. She looked at me with a peculiar mix of professional detachment and something like compassion. "You did the right thing by bringing us the information and by letting us do our job," she said. Her voice was steady, and I felt the words like an anchor. They took Derek to custody and served search warrants that night on his small apartment and a storage locker, where they later found documents that linked him to some of the companies Harold had traced. It was the sort of slow, methodical follow-through that I had come to admire. The agents found a trove of things that connected him to other victims: emails, forged signatures, notes on people's habits. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to point to a pattern. In the days that followed, charges were described to me in the caution language of prosecutors: fraud, conspiracy, schemes to defraud, identity theft where appropriate. The law is lovely in that way. It lays plans out like architecture. I was told that indictments could take months and that plea bargaining could complicate the optics. I was told, repeatedly, that the system wasn't instantaneous and that sometimes justice felt like waiting for a tide that might or might not come in. When Derek's mugshot circulated, if you've ever seen one, you know how chilling it is to look at a face that once delivered breakfast orders, now pixelated on a screen. People from beyond my circle called. Jennifer left a voicemail that sounded small and relieved. "He's going to answer for this," she said. Eleanor, who had been reluctant to speak publicly, left a message that was steady. "Thank you," she said, and then with a voice that had regained some color. "I didn't think anyone would listen." Those small responses were the currency of the early aftermath. Once the arrest happened, the investigative net widened. Herald's spreadsheets, basic as they were, became a backbone for subpoenas. Detective Chen coordinated with other counties. Agent Kim handled logistics that required federal reach. Forensic accountants combed records like archaeologists for currency. One by one, names and accounts and shell companies were connected until the Heartbreak Network, once a rumor in whispered phone calls, had a skeletal map. The more we saw, the more it became clear that Derek had been an operative within a structure that groomed, courted, and then harvested. It is worth noting that networks are not monoliths. They are flexible, adaptive, and often staffed by people who hide in plain sight. Some members are the charming instigators. Others are accountants who launder complaints into plausible deniability. Others are local enablers who arrange introductions at events and parties. The Heartbreak Network, when the investigators finally started to describe it aloud, was both heartless and banal. People who saw deep loneliness as opportunity and engineered access to it. The arrests that came later were the kind you read about in newspapers: coordinated early morning raids, simultaneous warrants in multiple states, a list of names that included not only Derek, but people with histories of similar alleged behavior. Marcus Webb, who had worked as a lifestyle consultant in 3 cities, was picked up at his apartment with his laptop open. There was a small round of press, and I realized, uneasily, that my story was becoming a part of a larger narrative. I had started as a homeowner making a cup of coffee and ended up a character in the public record. In the months after the arrest, the legal process moved at its own pace. Derek was arraigned, made predictable denials, and eventually accepted a plea in a related matter, details that, for courtroom reasons, I can't parse exactly here. He faced both state and federal scrutiny. What matters is less the specifics of his sentencing and more the fact that his case unspooled into something larger. The federal indictment that named several co-conspirators and described a pattern of manipulation that had harmed dozens. I want to be precise here because it matters. I did not orchestrate those federal actions. I provided information, I cooperated, and I gave statements. The justice system did the heavy lifting through processes that are painfully slow and at times frustratingly opaque. The message I want to leave with you is that individual action, calling a detective, collecting receipts, telling your story, matters. So do the professionals who can turn those pieces into an actionable case. In the aftermath of the legal work, there was a quieter, less public series of reckonings. I had to face the night I had crossed a line. I had to meet both the legal and moral consequences of my action. The task force considered whether to pursue any charges against me. They ultimately decided, after long conversations with prosecutors and a candid accounting of intentions and cooperation, not to bring charges, citing my complete cooperation, lack of intent to permanently harm, and my role in helping identify a pattern that led to larger arrests. That was their decision, not a reward, and it came with the caveat that my behavior had been risky and legally ambiguous. I volunteered for a kind of restitution that felt appropriate. I began to speak publicly about the dangers of private revenge and the importance of bringing concerns to authorities. That was partly practical. I wanted to make sure my actions did not become a model for others. It was partly penance. It was also, in the end, a new kind of agency, one that moves beyond one kitchen and into a public role. The FBI, recognizing the value of lived experience, asked me to stay involved. Initially, it was as a liaison. I would contact new victims when they were identified and provide a local point of truth in interviews. Then they asked if I would be willing to consult more broadly, sit in panels, speak at community events, help teach people how to recognize the patterns of the Heartbreak Network without encouraging vigilantism. I said yes, with the cautionary line I had learned to draw. Speak about patterns, not how-tos. Warn people without encouraging fear. Thus began a new chapter I had not anticipated. I started leading workshops at community centers and senior living facilities. I sat in rooms with women, sometimes men, who had been courted and then cheated out of savings. We talked about the small things that make predators effective: high-pressure intimacy, requests to isolate, the slow reframing of generosity into obligation. We talked about paperwork, what to keep and what to ask for, not as a checklist for meddling, but as a practical way of protecting autonomy. I also worked with Detective Chen and Agent Martinez to develop a protocol for outreach that balanced respect with investigative necessity. We created a downloadable checklist, basic, non-technical, that agencies could hand out after presentations. The point was practical and humane. Know who you are letting into your life, keep copies of important documents, and, crucially, tell someone you trust when things feel off. We emphasize legal channels and the importance of evidence over intuition alone. One case stands out among the many we helped. Carol Peterson was a woman whose charm-turned-predator had called her every night for months, telling small stories to earn trust. She had nearly signed away a portion of her property before a neighbor reached out to me after one of my workshops. Carol and I met in a church basement where the coffee was terrible and the chairs were comfortable. She had the look of someone who had been surprised by betrayal, but who was not yet broken. We worked with the local district attorney and delayed the transaction. The man moved on, frustrated by the failed harvest. Carol kept her house. She later sent me a photograph of her and her cat sprawled on the couch, both of them smug in the way survivors can be. There were other victories that were quieter. A refund negotiated for a woman in Portland who'd been charged for a non-existent caterer. A criminal complaint reopened in a county that had initially dismissed it as a civil dispute. The work was less glamorous than the headlines, but more meaningful in its slow, cumulative effect. We were not heroes in the comic book sense. We were a coalition of victims, professionals, and advocates who made the threshold for predatory behavior harder to cross. There were also the unintended consequences that teach you humility. I lost some friends in the process because people did not want to hear that their neighbor could be dangerous. Old acquaintances wrote uncomfortable emails, and, at one point, a legal threat landed on my doorstep from someone connected to Derek who claimed defamation. I learned to put those things in perspective. Most days, the world is full of small cruelties, but the point is to keep moving toward remedy. Sophia and I repaired ourselves in layered ways. Repair is not a single dramatic reconciliation. It is a long habit of trust building. We went to family therapy because two people can love one another and still need help negotiating the aftershocks of betrayal. We cooked together, simple things that had become sacred again. Omelets with a bit of parsley, toast burned on purpose to be eaten with jam. She began to come to the workshops with me sometimes, and the first time she spoke to a group about the way manipulation feels from the inside, I watched her and thought that I had not lost her. I had only helped her see a clearer map of the world. There were public moments, too. I testified in a congressional briefing at one point, a small room with hard chairs and a terrible microphone. The hearing was about elder financial exploitation and the way fraudsters exploit loneliness and social isolation. I told the truth about breakfast orders and polite men who become predators. I also told them, clearly, that the law needed resources. better cross-jurisdictional databases, more funding for elder protection units, and better training for bank officers to spot suspicious transfers. It was a policy moment, and an emotionally raw one. Members of Congress listened politely and promised to consider legislation. Promises from politicians are often the kind of thing you file alongside other hopeful items, but at least the conversation had begun. The media attention that followed the indictment was a mixed blessing. People reached out with stories of their own. Some were heartrending, many were brave. Others wanted the lurid details, which I refused to give because they would have been disrespectful to the victims. I found a rhythm: speak where it helps, be quiet where it helps more. The story about my son-in-law demanding breakfast at dawn and the FBI knocking on my door made good copy. It also obscured the long, patient work that followed. That is the hazard of headlines. What I do now, and have done since, is shepherd that headline into something useful. When I speak, even in small community centers, I start with the line that got people's attention. My son-in-law demanded breakfast at 4 a.m. People laugh, they lean in. Then I tell them what that line masks: the months of paperwork, the moral complexity of having done something foolish in a moment of fear, the long arc of legal processes, and the work it takes to prevent the next person from being targeted. There are a few concrete truths I have learned and now share. Predators use intimacy as leverage. Documentation saves stories from being dismissed as he said, she said. Law enforcement needs victims who are willing to cooperate and who are patient enough to let the complex wheels turn. These are not glamorous truths, but they are true, and they matter to the people I meet. I try to say them plainly and without moral theater. Our work also led, over time, to policy changes in a few counties where the Heartbreak Network had been most active. Task forces formed that combined financial investigators, elder protection advocates, and social workers. Bank employees received training on red flags that something with a personal touch could be a financial scam. There were legislative hearings, pilot programs, and, most importantly, people who regained homes and savings they thought they'd lost. Those are the things that keep me going. I also learned to be kinder to myself about the night I had chosen private revenge. I never want to make it sound trivial or heroic. It was a misstep that could have complicated the case and that exposed me to legal risk. I own it. I do not hide from it. And I use it as a cautionary tale in my talks. Anger is a powerful motivator, but in a legal system we must bring evidence, not a desire for immediate correction. Law is slow because it is meant to be careful. Derek's arrest and the unspooling of the Heartbreak Network did not end every manipulation. New predators surface. The work of education and vigilance is ongoing, but the difference between a world where no one noticed and a world where a community can marshal resources is enormous. Today, I help small homeowner groups understand estate planning, document retention, and safe practices for new relationships. I speak to caregiving communities about supporting elders who are socially vulnerable. I train volunteers at local libraries to spot the signs that a stranger is moving from helpfulness into control. There are days when I walk past the guest room and pause, not because I expect anything dramatic, but because my body still remembers the small sensory cues of that stormy period. The smell of Derek's cologne, the napkin stained with eggs Benedict. Those gifts of memory are not a prison, they are a map. They show me where I have been and where I choose to stand now. Sophia and I are not perfection. We are a mother and daughter who learned the hard lesson that love requires boundaries and that protecting one another is a skill you practice. Sometimes she teases me about my insistence on keeping a current list of important documents in a waterproof folder. Sometimes I tease her about the way she now reads contracts out loud to me before she signs a thing. We are closer for it. If there is a single image that has stayed with me, and I think about it often, it is the sound of the agent's knock on my door the night they came to arrest him. There was tension in that moment, yes, but there was also the sound of the state doing the work it is supposed to do, to hold people accountable. That knock closed a painful, intimate chapter and opened a public one. It turned private suspicion into a coordinated response that protected others. So, to anyone listening who wonders whether it's worth speaking up, it is. If something in your life feels off, if someone moves to isolate you, to accelerate financial decisions, or to pressure you into changing living arrangements, document what you can and contact authorities or a trusted advocate. You're not being dramatic, you're being prudent. And if you've done something in a moment of panic, be honest about it. The law will be complicated, but honesty is the best currency you have. This is not a story with a fairy tale ending. There are still court dates, messages that sting, and the knowledge that networks shift and find new ways. But there is also the truth that a woman who loved her home and her daughter refused to be silent, and that refusal, paired with competent law enforcement, careful documentation, and a network of trustworthy professionals, stopped people who had been practicing harm. If you're sitting where I once sat, wondering if you should keep your mouth shut or speak out, ask yourself which version of the future you want to choose. The one that lets predators continue in the shadows, or the one that strips them of their camouflage. I chose the latter, imperfectly and with regret for my missteps, but I chose it. If this story landed with you, leave a note in the comments about where you're watching from and whether you've ever smelled a pattern and hesitated to say something. If you want more stories like this, personal, messy, and with lessons on how to protect those we love, subscribe. And if anyone you know could use help spotting the signs of romance or asset fraud, encourage them to reach out to local elder protection services and law enforcement. There are resources and people whose whole job it is to help. I still make my tea the way my mother taught me. I still set the alarm sometimes, not to 4, but to a reasonable hour, and I still watch the horizon over Malibu. The house is quieter now, in the sense that the immediate danger is contained. But the work continues, as it must. And in the quiet, I sometimes imagine a world where the gull's noise is the only thing that announces the morning, and where no one can repurpose kindness into currency again. Until then, I'll keep doing my part. Listen, document, report, and, when necessary, tell the truth in a room full of people who can do something about it.